Welcome to the Leadership Collective podcast, where we bring you actionable insights from industry leaders to help you navigate global challenges. I'm your host again today, Chris Danks. I'm the founder of the Leadership Collective, and today we're going to be talking about a very exciting topic, the emerging destinations for global capability centres, also known as GCCs, and some other acronyms, across Africa and beyond. As organisations increasingly seek to establish global capability centres or centres of excellences, they're turning their focus to emerging countries. Africa in particular is becoming a key destination for businesses looking to tap into new opportunities, access untapped talent and unlock competitive advantages as they look to expand their businesses across the world. To go into this in a bit more detail, I'm thrilled to introduce two guests today. We have Mark Angus, the CEO and Chief Strategist at Genesis Global Business Services. Mark has 28 years of experience in the GBS, digital and IT sectors and has played a pivotal role in advising global businesses on their expansion strategies across Africa. I'd also like to welcome John Beardsley, an expert in digital livelihoods and global expansion. With over 20 years of experience as a business builder and consultant, John works extensively across Africa, designing interventions that create digital work opportunities and drive real impact. So I'd like to welcome you both to the podcast.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Good to be on today's podcast. Thank you.
To kick us off, Mark, would you mind giving us a brief definition of what a GCC or Global Capability Centre is? We did cover this on a previous podcast, but for anyone that's not seen any of the previous episodes, would you mind outlining a definition for us?
Yes, certainly, Chris. A GCC or a Global Capability Center is an in-house shared services operation or a delivery hub that's established within an organization to provide centralized and optimized business services. So it can be in areas such as technology development, process development, specialized support functions, and fall into areas like IT support, for example, finance and accounting, customer services, HR, and these capability centers can be based in offshore locations, providing and support to the internal organization for as a shared services operation. So basically what happens is the organization, a global multinational organization, would rely on the GCC to provide those support services to them and to enable this broad range of functional services servicing multiple business units of the company.
Great, thanks for the definition. That's really helpful. What sort of trends are you seeing on a global basis to start with when it comes to GCCs, as we'll refer to them?
So on a global basis, there definitely is more of increasing preference towards in-house operations or GCCs. A lot of people call them captive operations as well, over third-party outsourcing. We're seeing a trend towards that, and there's different reasons for that. A lot of the multinationals want to have the control themselves as opposed to outsourcing to a third party. They want to have a greater control, for example, over data security, efficiency, and then also be able to direct expertise, innovation, and thought leadership in specialized areas of the organization. So for them to have a GCC, it makes sense that they can have that control. Culture fit is another thing. They're wanting to ensure that there's a consistent culture fit across the organization when delivering services. So we're seeing certainly a trend towards that. However, in the outsourcing space, we're also seeing a trend towards what I call outsourcing 2.0, which is, the adoption of AI. We're hearing a lot about that in the sector at the moment. AI and using AI to enable agents and knowledge workers to do their jobs better, and to provide more specialized services. So the role of the outsourcer is also evolving, and we're seeing that they are having to quickly adapt to this new environment and to deliver more higher value, more complex services to the organizations that they service.
Perfect. And on our previous couple of episodes, when we were talking about GCCs, we had somebody called Vinu Nair, who was an expert in recruiting, specifically in India, and has a lot of knowledge around GCCs, and spoke a lot about how India is a very credible option for organisations to leverage the global capability centres. Moving across to Africa, why are emerging markets like Africa becoming hotspots for such initiatives also?
That's a good question. So India is the hub. We know that it's the largest market in terms of outsourcing services, but also in the GCC space, it's a major hub. Um, in Africa, however, is getting a lot of attention right now. We're certainly fielding a lot of queries. It's becoming the next frontier of services, not just in the outsourcing space, but also from a GCC environment. I know, for example, of three organizations that are currently looking at setting up GCC operations on the continent. So it comes down to the fact that there's rapid digital transformation on the continent. There's a young, dynamic workforce, and of course the cost advantages. That's the preeminent reason that a lot of organizations look to is the cost advantages and how competitive African locations are. So. The continent, as I mentioned, has a young, dynamic youth population, providing a sustainable talented pool. Around 60% of the population is under 25, so that's a significant number of talent that they can actually tap into. And then there's also a lot of cost advantages. So competitive labor costs, for example, salary costs, roughly 50 to 70% compared to traditional GCC locations. And then when you look at your total fully loaded operating costs, which includes not just salaries, but also facilities, IT costs, support staff, and so on, these are 30 to 60% lower than some of your other locations. So Africa definitely plays very well in terms of the competitive factors. And then we're also seeing this shift in terms of diversification. So whilst India and markets like the Philippines, for example, are major GCC hubs, there's a need for organizations to diversify, to decentralize for business continuity purposes, and to tap into under-tapped markets. And Africa is very well positioned to take that on, essentially.
Great. You touched a lot on the cost side. Well, you've touched on a number of areas there about why organisations are considering Africa as a continent. Would you mind expanding just slightly on the talent side? You mentioned that a large section of the workforce is under 25. From what I'm understanding and learning about GCCs from other experts, is that there's also more of a push now for organisations to look very closely, not just at the cost saving, but actually to find the right talent, put them in a central location, particularly niche talent in a world where skill shortages are becoming an increasing trend. Would you mind expanding just a little bit more on the talent side of things?
Yeah, absolutely. So now, when you look at all the major locations, so currently South Africa and Egypt are the largest both outsourcing and GCC locations on the continent. And there's a lot of pools of talent that are untapped across the continent. And they sit within areas such as customer service, tech-driven skill sets, for example, in cloud, software development. And one of the things that a lot of the GCC service delivery centers are tapping into is the fact that they are able to, that they're hungry, they're able to put them through work readiness or work integrated training, put them into their GCC centers, and there's the talent pools are scalable. So in each market, we track the monthly ramp up speeds, and there's more than enough talent in each location for them to tap into without depleting the talent pool. So they consider those factors, scalability. They're looking more at how they can train the talent. So there is education challenges in some of these locations in terms of when these workers come out of schools and out of colleges, they may not have the right soft skills, for example, that is required in some of these centers. So they do need to put them through some form of work readiness training or work integrated training. But once they do that, they have literally an untapped talent pool that they can deploy in their centers. So it definitely is a major driver for them when they're looking at Africa.
So that's really, really interesting insights. John, I know you're based in Kenya and have been working on the ground across the African continent for some time. Would you mind sort of expanding on what unique advantages does Africa offer businesses looking to set up GCCs or COEs yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I really moved here from New York full time in 2016, within the global business services space, it was early days. It was in Kenya specifically. South Africa is a different ball game. When you look at Africa as a continent, it's It's massive, right? You can fit Europe, North America, China inside of it. It's way bigger than people think. You have North Africa where you have some mature, locations like Tunisia, Egypt, Morocco, and then of course you have South Africa. And then in the middle, right, in the middle belt, you have these emerging destinations with massive youth populations, as Mark mentioned. Nigeria, Ethiopia, Ghana, Kenya, Rwanda all kind of stand out as destinations that, from a sourcing perspective, have become a lot more attractive over the last 10 years. My experience is that it's a unique environment, right? So in other words, when I say unique, I mean it's not as mature as India. It's also this nexus of all kinds of development professionals. There's certainly money within the ecosystem to do training, and so when Mark says that the population is young, I mean, look, Africa's working population is going to be 1.5 billion by 2050. Okay, so most of the world's increase in working population is going to come from Africa. India and Asia, by that same period, I believe, are actually going to decline slightly. Like their population is actually going to decline. Now that's 26 years out. But when you look at the fact that 17 of the 25 like big global systems integrators are already here, it's a place. But zooming in in Kenya, in a place like Kenya, I think you have a real opportunity as an employer, because you're not operating in a saturated market, to carve out, to be a premier employer, to be seen as, a place where everybody wants to go work, like Microsoft in the 80s or something, right? In Nepal, for example, when we started in Nepal, Cloud Factory, another very, frontier location at that time. But, you can basically be one of the largest, most well-known, most respected by government, most embedded within the ecosystem, the training ecosystem, the venture capital ecosystem, you name it. And so it's a real opportunity to stand out amongst candidates as well as the entire ecosystem. And it's really important to work with across the ecosystem, because you are in a location where things are going to change, right? There's not a robust NASCOM, right, like there is in India, in Kenya or Nigeria. And so I think it required a lot more elbow grease, 10 years ago. And now you have these really interesting constellations of businesses that are forming along with associations, specifically in those countries that I mentioned, Rwanda, Kenya, Nigeria, Ethiopia, and so forth.
Interesting. Very good. I believe as well there was Kenya's grid forecast is to be 100% green by 2030. Would you mind expanding on that? That's not something I necessarily expected, if I'm very honest. So where's that come from? Would you mind expanding around that point?
Well, yeah, I mean, Kenya's a bit unique in that area, just because there's so much geothermal, there's so much solar, wind power. It's in a very unique position. It's done a really nice job in terms of harnessing that. In addition, I mean, Microsoft is putting $1 billion data center in Kenya, and so Kenya in particular, along with a couple other countries I just mentioned, have been the beneficiaries of a lot of investment. There's been $13 billion in venture capital invested in Africa in the last like 5-6 years, and so we're starting to see some of that maturation take place. And compute power, data centers, all that has held, I think, Africa back to some degree, outside of maybe South Africa, for a long time, and you're starting to see the investments that are changing that.
Mark, just coming back to you for a second, kind of a related question to what we were talking about earlier. If you're an organisation and there's a selection of countries that an organisation could look at when they're setting up a GCC, how should, in your opinion, organisations make that decision? What kind of factors do you think they should take into account, and how would that link into their decision making around Africa?
Yeah, good question. So there's a number of factors that they need to take into account. The first being the talent availability, as I alluded to earlier on, access to a skilled, scalable, talent and diverse workforce is important. So they need to look at that as a major factor, and then evaluated the education systems in the country. To make sure that there's a prevalence of the in-demand skills that they need in areas like, for example, IT or data analytics or customer service. And then, of course, there is challenges. So we know that some of those locations that don't meet those education requirements, or the education curricula or system. So they would need to also ensure then that there are work readiness or work integration programs available in those countries to support workers, to make them work ready. And it can be even in areas like, as I mentioned, soft skills, communication and elocution and a number of different factors that we take for granted, but they would need to receive that training in order to make them work ready. Culture fit, very important. So ensuring that the organization's values and culture are taken into account when setting up a GCC center. It's difficult to do that when you're basing it in another location, and especially in a location in another far shore location or market like Africa. It's difficult to ensure that culture does across an organization does carry across. So you do need to be adaptable there. Generally speaking, a lot of African locations do have cultural similarities to markets in Europe and the US. So there is that culture fit that they should make sure is there and that they can leverage off. The cost structures. So my point earlier on about labor costs, streamlining operational efficiencies, ensuring that they're able to do that. Is there available real estate? What are the government incentives in place as well that help them in terms of enabling the sector and help them incentivize them to set up in the location, and of course political stability. So you want to make sure that that they are able to continue to operate in the location, that they are able to have sustained business continuity, ease of doing business, and then. Another factor I should mention is the regulatory environment. So, with a lot of countries, do they adhere, for example, to data protection, to GDPR rules, and ensuring that that is in place so that if they're going to base their GCC center in those locations, that they adhere, that there's regulatory environment and framework is in place. So I think it's important for them to do a very in-depth due diligence on the locations, ensuring that they conduct thorough market research, not just a brief overview market diagnostic. They need to do the due diligence with feasibility studies to make sure that it's the right fit for them, essentially.
Yeah, John, is there anything you can add to that?
Yeah, I mean, and look, I've done my fair share of of global indices and looking at stuff on desktop research and doing Zoom calls, but in this context. Especially in sub-Saharan Africa, there's just no substitute for relationships and getting yourself on the ground, and touching and feeling the facilities. And CCI just opened up in a call center. It's a $50 million facility, and the Ambassador Meg Whitman, and the former CEO of eBay and HP was there. President Ruto was there. And I don't know that I lived in New York City for a long time, worked in New York City. I don't know that I've ever seen a building as nice as that building, as LEED certified and so forth. But stuff like that, right? Sort of these aha moments of like, oh, I get it. I can set up in Africa. And this is important. And I think the combination of seeing it, but also developing relationships over time is really, really critical. It's more of a togetherness spirit, I would say, to some degree, again, because it's not so mature. It's not like people are at each other's throats, and so it's important to develop relationships with senior recruiters. Obviously, I know that's your background, Chris. There's a number of specialists now that specialize in senior talent in the African market. So yeah, anyway, those are top thoughts.
You both touched on the cultural side of things in different ways. I'm wondering if it for our audience it might be worth expanding on that a little bit. So, like you mentioned that there's a lot of alignment, shall we say, with you mentioned the European culture, for example. Would you mind expanding on that a little bit more around the cultural, the cultural similarities and maybe some of the differences as well?
Yes, absolutely. So if you look at a lot of the markets and countries in Africa, they are either previous British or French colonies, dare I say. So they basically would have, those cultural similarities based on the historical factors. So having had being in a colony, but now also part of the Commonwealth, they would have similarities in terms of language, the lifestyle factors as well that are prevalent in those locations. So when you look at the Anglophone destinations, predominantly South Africa, for example, Kenya, Ghana, a lot of similarities to the UK, for example, and they on the same time zones as well, which is another important factor that needs to be taken into consideration. And then you look at your francophone markets, markets like Rwanda, which is bilingual, French and English, Morocco, Tunisia, Senegal. They have very strong similarities in terms of French culture, and again, it comes from the historical factors. So that does play very well when you are setting up a GCC location, because some of those fundamental culture similarities are there. But then as an organization, you'd need to then ensure that your culture management, your culture strategy is carried across from wherever you're based onshore to those locations. As I mentioned, it is hard. You also need to be adaptable. You can't expect them to fit, within your culture, because they do have, other nuances to their local cultures and where they're based. So you do need to be flexible and adaptable, but you can still carry your corporate culture over into your GCCs in those locations. So it's pretty important, and it really is a key requirement if you are wanting to ensure that they are not looked at, for example, as being another team in a far shore location, and they're not, they don't feel like they're part of your overall structure and part of your overall team, essentially.
Absolutely, yeah. John, is there anything else that you want to add around that before I move on?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that when if you're setting up a GCC, you're going to look at the capital cities, and when you look at capital cities, like Nairobi, Accra, Lagos, they're pretty cosmopolitan, actually, right? And the infrastructure is a lot better than you might think if you've never been there. But Africa, you have to, like I said, get on the ground, or do your research, have your conversations on Zoom, but then get on the ground and pick your city on a city level. It's going to each city feels a little different. There's 2,000 languages spoken in Africa. It's 54 countries. There's a lot of cultural diversity. And so if in Kenya, for example, if you want to strike up a conversation with an Uber driver, right, it's always going to be about the Premier League. Everybody, and every matatu, which are the transport buses, the public transport buses here, is Chelsea, or it's Arsenal, or it's Liverpool. And so in terms of what they're following, the music they're listening to, and so forth, it's probably a lot more similar than you might think. I would just add that.
And if I may just add there, Chris, the two major locations I mentioned earlier on are South Africa. South Africa has got a lot of similarities to your English Anglophone culture, and then also Dutch as well, with the Afrikaans population in the country. So there's similarities there. And then you've got Egypt, which is another hub, and it's just a very big strategic location for multi-talented, multi-language support. They've also got cultural similarities, not just to nearshore Europe, but also to the Middle East region. So there's a lot of Arabic work, for example, being fulfilled out of Egypt. So to John's point, it's a diverse continent. There's lots of culture pots that one can tap into, but it's important to ensure that you do your due diligence before you to ensure that there is that correct fit and that you're able to tap into those similarities.
Yeah, and this may go without saying, but we had at Cloud Factory, we had a big US team, a UK team, a Nepal team, and a Kenya team. And it's just important to get everybody in each other's offices as much as possible, right? And to build those relationships. And our Africa team and our Asia team worked really well together. I think it was only, a 3-hour difference, right? And Kenya was nicely placed because it was almost the same as GMT, and then, only 6-7 hours from the US. So, yeah.
was just going to ask actually about where you're seeing GCCs coming from. Are you seeing lots of US organizations, headquartered organizations move to Africa? Obviously taking into account that time difference, which isn't so bad, but maybe not as close as some other regions. Is it mostly European organizations because of the time difference, cultural alignment and things? You've touched on Middle East. Is there a sort of trend that you're seeing, or is it pretty mixed?
It's mixed, but predominantly the largest markets are the US, UK, and then elements of Europe. Those are the three major markets that we're seeing, from a GCC perspective.
Perfect. Okay, good. And let's talk a little bit about safety. I know in parts of Africa have maybe a reputation for being dangerous. However, I know that looking at the Global Peace Index, it's revealed that many of the African countries are much more peaceful than even parts of the US, Europe, and other parts of the world. Would you mind giving your perspectives on that, especially as people that work in Africa and live there as well?
Yeah, I could jump in there. Look, I lived a long time in New York City. I lived very briefly in North Carolina and a long time in Nairobi. And the only place that I've ever had any real violence or robbery or whatever was in the U.S. And so there's this thing called as you said, the Global Peace Index. It's like this composite of 23 different quantitative and qualitative things. And the US ranks 132, India's 116. But then you have a country like Ghana that's at 55. And so I think, and as is typical of so many things in life, you fear what you don't know. And you have this vision of Africa, maybe that came from Bob Geldof in the 80s. And that's just not what's going on. Now, that doesn't mean that you you just want to walk around in Nairobi and Johannesburg looking at your phone, unaware of your surroundings. But I wouldn't do that in a lot of places in the so-called developed world either. So yeah, I don't know, Mark. You grew up here.
Yeah, I grew up in Zimbabwe, so I had first-hand account of living on the continent, and then I lived in South Africa for quite a while, almost 17 years actually. And yeah, I experienced the lifestyle in on the continent. I've traveled also extensively across the continent, and yeah, like John says, you do need to be aware. The good news is that there in locations, for example, like South Africa, the government is very aware that workers need to be safe, that they need to ensure that there is reliable and safe transport, for example, to and from work for them. And those initiatives are in place. The facilities as well where GCCs operate from are highly safe and secure, and those initiatives are all in place to ensure that there's that added level of security. So yeah, so I think it's I do like what John said earlier on about the elbow grease. If you're willing to take that plunge, if you're willing to say, right, I'm going to take this on, and I'm going to look at Africa as a location and get past that hurdle, there's just a hungry talent pool that can service your organization and provide great services to your customers.
Yeah, and Chris, I was listening to I think it was your last episode, talking about, and you probably remember the numbers, but the number of applicants and then the percentage of applicants in India that you think that you've landed the candidate and so forth. That's not going to be the case here like that, right? And then there's pluses and minuses with that, right? But if you're, for example, working hand in glove with a Moringa school or a Gabeya or a Decagon or any of these organizations that are really doing demand-led scaling for software engineering, cybersecurity, data science, you name it, and you kind of develop that relationship. It's not as broad of a talent pool, but I think your attrition rate is going to be lower. Your just whole recruiting process is going to be a lot smoother. Maybe. I don't know. I've never recruited in India. Sounds like you have, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious. I put you on the spot. I don't know if you'll have the exact stats, but you said one of the challenges in India, for example, is I think you're alluding to there, John, is that so many of the individuals that accept a job offer don't show up on day one, and a huge percentage of them that accept an interview then don't turn up for the interview. Similar kind of trend. I think the average is you have to hire 2 people for every one starting the job, which is, it's incredibly high. It's an incredibly big problem, I would say. How does that transfer to Africa? Are you saying that that's far less common, kind of similar to like it is in Europe, where 95+% of people that say they're going to attend an interview do, and that are going to start a role also turn up on their first day?
Yeah, I don't have the exact stats. Maybe we could look at it afterwards. But I mean, my experience has been that yes, you do also get a lot of applications, but it pretty quickly emerges the short list of the 5 or 10 that are strong. And if you're a global company, so for example, right, in Kenya today, we've got around 1.9 million people in Kenya working in digital jobs in one way or another. But most of that, 98% of that, is not for a global company, right? So if you have a clear career pathway, that's going to be extremely valuable as an employer value proposition to somebody that's coming out to a top-notch, top 1 or 2% person coming out of that's maybe a full stack engineer. Kenya we have Oracle, we have Microsoft, and so forth here. It's just not saturated like that. So you really have the chance to develop that relationship with a young candidate, and I think have them be there for 10 years, the way it used to be in the 50s in the US when you just worked at a job for 10, 15 years, right?
Yeah, I forgot to add that. So there's initiatives on the continent that were started, actually spearheaded and pioneered in South Africa, and have now spilled over globally. The impact sourcing initiative. So that is where you would hire talent from previously disadvantaged communities, socioeconomic differences, and put them into a job. And those workers, which roughly make up roughly 30% of the GBSBPO workforce on the continent, they tend to be a lot more committed, a lot more dedicated to their job, because when they get a job, they're not only looking after themselves, they're looking after their families, and by default also the communities around them. And that one job can actually enable a whole family, for them. So those programs are quite active across the continent. In some cases, governments like South Africa are even incentivizing organizations to adopt impact sourcing, and you generally will find that those workers are a lot more dedicated, and the attrition rates is a lot more lower in that instance. And I can say, just from the global studies, that Africa's attrition rates are definitely lower than India. Just the track that we've had in terms of our indexes. And so and we expect that trend to continue. And you're quite right about what you said about India in terms of the 2-for-1 job process. Yeah, it's quite a big challenge for them.
Yeah, and I think if I was a large global enterprise looking at Africa, I think what's so exciting too is you get to kind of shape the future alongside your team that's on the ground here, and alongside the ecosystem and the government. It's still malleable. It still has the opportunity to respond to AI in a way that's extremely agile. And we always talk about leapfrogging in Africa with M-Pesa and with fintech, and fintech's probably the most successful. You have the most successful stories. There's the most unicorns are in fintech that come out of Africa, right? But I guess, yeah, just my point is it's not a set. It's not, the dial is not set, and so that can be kind of fun too.
That's great. I mean, it sounds like there's lots of positives and lots of good reasons why organisations already are moving their presence into Africa. Would you mind looking at the other side of the coin and tell us what significant challenges organisations face when they're moving into, we're talking Africa as a continent here. I know there's going to be a lot of differences country by country, but would you mind offering some insights into some of the challenges?
I can jump in there. Yeah, I mean, I think that I guess the flip side of what I just said, right, is you get to shape it, you get to be a driver of the ecosystem, but the ecosystem's not well coordinated, right? So, you have in we talked about NASCOM, right, in South Africa, and again they're an outlier. They're in a more mature state. It's a $5 billion annual global business services industry there. But as you start to look at that next level of okay, let me take a closer look at Senegal, Ghana, Kenya, Ethiopia. It can be frustrating, right? That maybe the stakeholders don't understand what incentives and regulations are really going to push the industry forward. They may not even understand the definitions of the industry. And in fairness, this particular industry has a lot of acronyms, maybe 10% more than most, at least. So I would say ecosystems not being coordinated, and I would say, it's tough to quantify this, but most sourcing specialists and professionals are going to be looking at LATAM, going to be looking at Asia, and they're not really even going to take time to look at Africa. And why is that? And I think it has a lot to do with negative perception. And brand Africa is not particularly strong when it comes to an industry that thrives on SLAs. Just do it for me. I want seamless integrations. And they think, well, that's not going to work there, right? So I think really, as a company that's up here, and as governments have done, Rwanda's doing a great job with this with GBSGI. You got to hit that head on, but that is a downside. And so if you're servicing global clients and they say, hey, I want to shift 1,000 seats, or I want to shift my GCC, this specialist GCC of 50 people, over into Africa, they're going to have all kinds of stakeholders are going to have questions about, wait a second, what about security? What about geopolitical risks? What about this? What about that? And it just comes through in a way that I think doesn't come through with the more mature locations. I don't know, Mark, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think there's challenges as well in terms of the education systems. Like I mentioned, some of the countries do have education systems or education curricula that's not suited for for GCCs and for providing the right work ready talent that they require. And that's quite a systemic issue in a number of countries on the continent. And you're seeing initiatives there to work around those. And then you're also seeing there are certain infrastructural challenges in some countries, whether it's, linkage to the global grid or ICT infrastructure, or even, just general infrastructure in terms of facilities. There can be issues with those. Utilities as well, so power outages, and in certain countries are also an issue and a challenge. But what you're finding is that a lot of the GCCs are working around those. They become quite creative in some sense. So, for example, if there's power outages, they've adopted sustainability practices to ensure that they have, for example, solar or other types of services in place to actually make sure that they have reliable power. You're also seeing, as what John was saying, is that the industry gets together to actually come up with solve those common issues and solve those common problems. So yeah, Africa is not without its risks and its challenges, absolutely. But what you're finding is that the organizations that are there, and there's some significant organizations, like I could name a few, that have worked around those issues, and as a result are now leveraging the opportunities that are there.
So it's really tough. So what you're seeing in rural India, even, right, is that you can operate, right, and that the infrastructure is pretty good, but you don't really want to go up country, because what you see is in Nairobi, in Lagos, in Joburg and whatever, you're always going to have generators. You're always going to have a workaround, but if you get out into the more rural areas where the costs are really low, then it's difficult to operate still.
Stick to the major cities, basically, is what most people are doing at the moment, more or less.
Yeah, I think you kind of have to if you're doing a GCC. Although there are workarounds for that too, especially if you're talking about, if you're paying $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, $8,000 a month, people then can figure it out themselves too, right? Versus a more BPO model where, you're sub $1,000 a month, and you can't expect people to go out and buy an expensive, solar generator for their house.
Yeah, understood. Okay, well, thank you both for giving balanced perspective. Despite some of those challenges that you've talked about, would you, Mark, maybe you can give us some insights into some success stories of companies that have set up a GCC in Africa? I think John, you mentioned, was it Oracle earlier, Microsoft, but are there any others that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, John mentioned Microsoft, Oracle, great examples. Amazon, so Amazon has established and scaled its GCC operations in South Africa. They've got a huge center that they've built in Cape Town, and I think it's employing between 3,000 to 4,000 people at the moment and scaling up across the country. They've also got pockets of talent that they've employed in South Africa across the country. And so they're a great example of a GCC center that is tapping into the English talent pool in a market like South Africa. BMW, so BMW has a GCC center also in Johannesburg in South Africa, supporting its global supply chain. And they've really taken advantage of the skilled workforce. They've also, gotten very much involved with the industry in terms of, ensuring that there is for example, the skills development challenges or anything else like that need to be overcome. They're working with industry to actually ensure that happens. Lufthansa has a GCC operation operating out of Cape Town, providing multilingual customer service and customer service support. And I would be remiss if I didn't say Vodafone. So Vodafone out of Egypt, they've got a GCC center servicing global consumers out of Egypt. So those are just some examples of major brands that are doing that. We're seeing, as I mentioned in the previous part of this the podcast when we started, there definitely is a trend towards that. You're seeing a lot of organizations saying, we want to establish our own GCC operations, we want to have that control. But we want to base it in a nearshore or farshore location. And so there definitely is a trend. I can think of 3 right now that are currently scoping and looking at setting up in the continent.
Interesting. So it's definitely a trend then. Big names in there as well, right? So there's obviously a high degree of confidence from some of those organizations.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's all about the flavor of risk. Once you're sold on, I want to have a presence in Africa, it's just sort of your flavor of risk. I mean, South Africa, Morocco, Egypt is going to be that conservative level, and then it's Kenya, Nigeria, Rwanda on the next, and and then it kind of goes from there. So yeah, it's kind of something for everybody.
Great. Well, I know we're coming towards the end of time now. Just to wrap things up, I wondered if both of you would mind maybe giving your top 3 summarised points on things to consider when setting up a GCC. Would you mind just giving us some final thoughts? Maybe Mark, you can kick us off.
Yeah, so I think based on what we discussed today, understanding the local market dynamics is very important. So ensure that you conduct the right due diligence, that you conduct thorough research, covering all areas of the country, and even, as John said, on a city by city location perspective, looking at where you can feasibly set up your GCC operation is really important, and recognizing the strengths and the challenges of each location so that you can make sure that you make the right choice. And then adopting a long-term strategy is really important. So with that, ensuring that you have, for example, not just the facilities, and you've not just tapped into the talent pool, but you can also develop your own talent pipelines. You can work with local partners to develop those talent, the talent that you require, and make sure that talent is the right fit for your GCC operation. And then I want to latch onto what John says, and sorry John if I'm stealing one of your points, but sustainable partnerships. So ensuring that you have sustainable partnerships in place at various levels with the industry association, with local partners in terms of training and skills development, with the government. So ensure that you're connected. Don't just set up an operation in isolation to the sector. Tap into that enabling environment that is there, and ensure that you leverage that, because it can really help you with a lot of the challenges that you may experience in those locations.
Yeah, Mark, I think you took 2 out of 3 there, but that's okay. That's okay, because I think what I can jump in on that, right, and say develop a really crisp employee value proposition. If you're gonna come to the continent, again, 1.5 billion people, working population by 2050, it's gonna be about people. That's why you're gonna be here. And so developing that employee value proposition, how do you do that? You get to know people, you do your surveys, you go to where where they're living. You talk to a diverse set of stakeholders. I mean, I remember when I first got to Kenya and remote digital work was seen as a scam. I remember having to I was talking to everybody. I mean, I was talking to pastors at Nairobi Chapel, about let me come speak at, it's a different environment, but it is about people. And so I would say, don't just think about what are the business drivers for this unit or that unit. That's obviously why you're there in the first place. But, get that crisp value proposition. Carve out the career pathways for people. They'll appreciate that. You'll appreciate that in the long run too, in terms of attrition. I would also say advertise your wins. So often we have these celebrations internally on Slack, but it doesn't take that much to tell the local ecosystem what's going on in terms of the wins you're getting. You don't have to go into all your strategic client specifics. But you can say, we're hiring again, or we have this particular milestone in terms of a building, and that stuff leads into what Mark just said about developing external local champions, right? Because in this context, people are, as Mark said, extraordinarily hungry. But it's not just people that are employees and that are young people and workers. It's the entire ecosystem wants wins. Well, runs on the board, and so when we hear about a success story, we want to share the learnings, get out there. That's how that kind of flywheel spins up. And then, back to impact sourcing, right? Back to partnering with training organizations. I don't know that there's a richer environment for that in the world in terms of a continent. I don't know what the stats are, Mark, on that, but I know that Everest Group and others, and through the Clinton Initiative, and I used to be part of the Global Impact Sourcing Coalition and Rockefeller Foundation. I know that there's a pact right now to get up to 1 million workers in terms of impact sourcing. But man, that's something that you may not be familiar with if you're just working in Asia and Latin America. But do your homework on who those organizations are. They can make your life a lot easier when it comes to acquiring talent, and the story better for everybody.
And Chris, if I could just add one more element to that, we alluded earlier on to culture and cultural similarities. I think one needs to have a cultural process in place, a change management process in place, because when you set up a GCC operation in another location, your existing employees in your current location, for example, where your head office is based, that might be in Europe or the UK or US, they're going to start to get edgy about are we going to lose jobs? Are they going to be placed in other locations? And so there needs to be that change management process in place to ensure that firstly they're looked after, the current employees, that they know that their jobs are fairly safe, and that the new teams that are brought on in these far-flung locations or nearshore locations are incorporated into that change management strategy, so they become part of that team. That's really important. So when you are looking at this, you want to ensure that you adapt your strategy to the workforce that you're with. We want to ensure that you don't kill their spirit. You're tapping into workers that are very dynamic, very enthusiastic. You don't want to kill that spirit, but at the same time, you want to make sure that they are adopted into your broader corporate environment and that become a part of your one team.
Yeah, and do some proper onboarding in terms of what if you've never been involved in a company that's in global business services or a GCC. Take your time and onboard people into what it looks like to work within a business environment with US customers, or and I know that sounds very obvious, but I'm just saying maybe put a little extra resource there and a little extra time from the senior level or mid-level managers who've been around the block. Bring them there. That shortens the learning curve quite a bit.
That's great. Thank you both, Mark and John, for those insights. I've definitely learned a lot myself, specifically about GCCs in the context of Africa. I'm hoping and I'm sure that our audience will learn a lot from this also. So it's very clear that Africa is a very serious location for GCCs as well. And that's something for people really to consider when they're looking across the world as to where they might want to set up. If you do want to explore this topic further as our listeners, please don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and visit the leadershipcollective.global website for further content on GCCs, looking at lots of different locations across the world, and the GCC theme as a whole, which is certainly trending at the moment. Thank you everyone for listening in and taking the time to join us here with John and Mark, and we will see you next time on the next podcasts, where we will look at sharing other global insights with you across the board.